and welcome.
I grew up here in Southern California. I was born in Los Angeles. My parents were divorced when I was quite young, 9 years old, and we moved all over Southern California. I eventually wound up at Big Bear Lake High School, where I didn't graduate, I dropped out. I was a high school dropout. Went into the Army, finished through correspondence with my high school. I don't even know if they had GEDs back in those days, but I did finish high school. The last year took me about 3 years while I was in the Army. From there I went to work for a couple of years, and then I started college, and I went to school here. Actually, I started school here about 41, 42 years ago, graduated in January 1969. So it's been 40 years and a few months to me, but I was an accounting major, and I think accounting was part of the reason why I've done so well, because I really understand how a business functions. But at the end of the day, it's okay to count. You know what you did, that's historical. At the end of the day, you have to sell stuff. And that's what I'm really I'm a salesman. You're all too young to remember, but back in the 50s and 60s, AT&T had a monopoly, a legalized monopoly in the United States, and they were the only company that provided phone service, both local, long distance, and all of the equipment. And in 1967, there was an FCC decision called the Carter phone decision, which allowed competitive companies to sell to businesses phone systems, PBXs, and key telephone systems. So that's what I did. I was right there at the beginning of an industry, much the same way as Steve Jobs or Bill Gates was at the start of the computer industry. I worked for a guy here in Orange County that was in sort of a predecessor business to selling telephone systems. He sold sound systems and intercoms, and I worked for him while I was still going to school. And then after I graduated, I was all set to go to work for one of the big accounting firms. And he says, well, why don't you try sales? So I took some sales courses, not at college. I took them, you know, like Dale Carnegie, and I took one that was called the Larry Wilson training course, and then I got a bunch of tapes. I used to listen to those in my car on a portable, you know, cassette player and so on. So after college, I went to work and I started selling. Right at the time, the new industry was starting, and after about 6 months I said, well, you know, I understand the sales end of this, I understand the business end. And prior to going to school, I worked for Western Electric, and I had gotten an education in the military in electronics, so I knew the technical end of it. And I sort of did an inventory of skills, and I said, you know, I know all of the components of a business. I'm going to start my own business. And when I told the guy I was going to work for at the accounting firm, it was Arthur Young, which is now part of Ernst & Young, he just laughed. He says, you'll be back. Well, fortunately, I wasn't. You know, everything happens generally with a salesman. And you guys have got one of the best salesmen in the world here, Dean Curry. He called me up one day, and I'm driving down the street, you know, and I'm talking to him on the phone. He called me up, just a cold call, and he said, I'd like to get to meet you, and that's how it started. But I had coincidentally been thinking about doing something with Cal State Fullerton for a long time. Trouble is I was so busy, I never had the time to pick up the phone myself and call. Now, if the new law in California were in effect, I wouldn't have answered the phone. So you see, timing is very important too. Being in the right place at the right time. Well, I'll tell you, this is probably something you wouldn't run into today, but back then I would call somebody up and say, I'd like to talk to you about your telephone system, and they'd say, well, are you with AT&T? And I'd say, no, we're a competitor. And you'd hear click. You know, and then if you did get somebody, they'd say, well, you can't sell me my phones, I can only get them from AT&T. Or if you got a little bit further and you made a proposal to them, maybe the second or third call you'd come back and the police would be waiting for you because they thought it was a scam. So those are some of the more interesting ones. But we also set up dealers. After just a couple of years, I was selling equipment for other companies. And my customers would say, well, can you do this, can you do that? And I'd say, I don't know, let me check with my supplier. So I'd go to my supplier and I'd say, well, can you do this, can you do that? And they say, look, we've been in this business for 60 years. Your customers don't need that. I said, but my customers do, they're asking for it. And so I remember one of the fellows, probably my age back then, he looked like a real old character, but he put his finger right in my chest like this, and he says, Sonny, if you're so smart, why don't you go do it yourself? You know, I did. The guy that I had worked for here in Orange County, I thought, you know, I don't want to compete against him because he taught me the business, so I moved to Phoenix. That's how I wound up in Phoenix, even though I grew up here. And I was all set to start the business all by myself. And he said, look, have you considered you're going to need lines of credit with your suppliers, and you're going to need this and that, and bookkeeping and all the rest? I said, well, no, I really hadn't. So he was my partner for the first 18 months. And he brought some of the expertise. But if you're going to start with a partner, make sure that you have complementary skill sets, because it's the best way to ruin a good relationship if one person thinks they're doing more than the other. So if you're the sales side, the Mr. Outside or Ms. Outside, you got to have a Mr. or a Ms. Inside. You know, somebody that does the books, does all of the ordering, and that's fulfillment, that sort of thing. And you do the sales or marketing or both. Fear of failure is a very good motivator. And I've had a few of those in my career. For one reason or another, where I came this close to failing. You just work a lot harder. Well, one of the lessons is to turn your phone off. Let's see in here. This is the president of my company. Let me just answer it. Hey, Clint, I've got you on the speakerphone. I'm talking to, looks like about 200 students here at Cal State Fullerton. You want to say hello? What's happening? Now, one of the things that getting all this inventory taught me over time as we got bigger is turning your inventory as fast as you can. When we sold the business, we were turning the inventory we turned it 13 times a year, so that's about every 27 days, less than 4 weeks. Our competitors were turning their inventory about every 150 or 180. Now, what does that mean? You have to have a lot more capital for more inventory. Plus, you get a lot of obsolescence, you get a lot of shrinkage, otherwise known as theft, you get a lot of breakage, those sorts of things. So that was a very important lesson. I learned the reason why it's so important to turn your balance sheet as quick as you can. So I don't think recessions are anything to be afraid of. They're a normal, cyclical type of an occurrence. But I think they can be the best time to start a business because everyone's running scared and people are giving up.